Some people believe that the only way to get premium hi-fi sound is to pay premium hi-fi prices. I disagree with this sentiment. There's a lot more hype behind expensive gear than there is substance, and when you come right down to it, an audiophile should be more interested in the music than in the gear. In my view, gear in the sub $1,000 range is all you will ever need. You can find plenty of options in this price category. And staying true to the typical release cycle, we have a new headphone contender in the affordable price bracket. Today, we're going to talk about the Sivga Oriole. This headphone costs $199 or 250 euros. Sivga sent me the Oriole to review. Let's find out what it has to offer. The Oriole is a brand new release. Sivga's tagline for the Oriole is, quote, classic and fashionable. They claim that the 50mm dynamic driver is proprietary and presents a balanced sound without fatigue for long-term listening. They say that the Oriole has, quote, moderate bass, smooth mids, fresh and exquisite treble. Sivga promises wide soundstage with good separation of instruments. The majority of Sivga's marketing is devoted to the design and manufacturing of this headphone. Unfortunately, Sivga did not provide me with a frequency response graph. While light on specifics, at least Sivga does not delve into hyperbolic promises, unlike some other brands. The Oriole has a familiar yet distinct style. There are aspects of this headphone which show a resemblance to some of Sivga's other entries, but there's also clear differences. That difference, at least in one part, is the diamond-shaped cutout on the ear cup. The Oriole is made of metal and rosewood. The ear cups are wood. The yoke and headband are metal. The ear cups swivel 180 degrees to lay flat, and have some horizontal and vertical adjustment as well. The ear pads are soft memory foam. Sivga says these are leather. The headband is also soft foam, but is covered by synthetic leather. The ear pads do not use any proprietary mounting system. These are easily replaceable with any third-party ear pads that generally conform to the ear cups. The Oriole is also fairly light. The headphone weighs about 10 ounces. This headphone comes with a carrying pouch and a dual 2.5mm cable. Like with Sivga's other cables, this one is well-made, sturdy, and transmits little microphonics. Unfortunately, Sivga does not include a set of spare ear pads. As for comfort, I found the Oriole to be rather easy to wear. I wouldn't say that these are so light that you won't notice them on your head. Instead, I thought that the padding was plush and mitigated against discomfort even for longer listening sessions. The clamping force is a little bit on the lighter side. That is, it's lighter than the HD6XX and the Hi-Fi Matsundara. The Oriole was able to make a full seal around my ears. While this headphone does dampen some ambient noise due to the close-back design, you can still hear typing on a mechanical keyboard and conversations a few feet away. I could easily wear the Oriole for 3 to 4 hours without any discomfort. Overall, the Oriole is a well-built, decently accessorized headphone. I cannot find any quality control issues at this point, and Sivga's attention to detail remains a stark contrast to some other Chinese brands who have a history of inconsistent QC. I wish that Sivga had included extra set of ear pads, but that is the limit of my gripe respecting build and comfort. To test the Oriole, I used it with my RME 80i2 DAC, Burson 3XR, Low 2 Paw S1, EcoZerta ITM03, and a plethora of other portable devices. I use the stock accessories. I listen to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The Oriole is not difficult to drive. If you do not have a dedicated amplifier, then don't worry about it. But if you choose to use one, a moderately powerful amp will do just fine. Sivga says that the headphone has moderate bass. My tests suggest it has close to neutral sub-bass and elevated mid-bass. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning, which builds into a crescendo. The Oriole presented this detail. The rumble was as loud as what I heard on the neutral ALO S4X. Transius was also similar. When the crescendo hit, the Oriole made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was emphasized but did not overwhelm the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The Oriole presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Oriole rendered them all similarly. In other words, the various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike melded with the next. None of the drum hits were sharp or piercing. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the Oriole easily presented the sub-bass and made it sound similar to what the audeze 4X does. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the middle of a medium-sized room. The vocals were about 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicaria playlist. I used these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the Oriole has close to neutral sub-bass and a marginally elevated mid-bass. There's average clarity in this region. Sivga says that the Oriole has smooth mids. My tests indicate that the mids are forward and sibilant. In Ola Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The Oriole presented and emphasized the sibilance. It was patently obvious when I compared the Oriole against the more neutral Aventone planar. The Oriole sibilance push was a bit greater than what I heard on the audeze 4X as well. However, the Oriole's emphasis was without doubt less than the HD560S. Oriolus' voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The drums were slightly louder than the other instruments, but did not drown out the vocals. In Want You Back by Haim, the Oriole again showed that it emphasizes vocal sibilance. This was a bit greater than what I heard on the audeze 4X. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Oriole rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The Oriole initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. However, when the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice until I was just barely able to concentrate to pick them apart. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The drums generally were louder than the rest. The vocals remained 1 to 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the Oriole presented the ukulele, drums, and bass, but the drums were a little bit louder than the other elements. All instruments melded their notes together slightly. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was not emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The Oriole just barely presented this minute distinction. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Oriole presented this detail. Overall, the Oriole has forward mids. Female vocal sibilance is emphasized. Drums are slightly louder than other mid-centric instruments in a mix. Sivga says that the Oriole has exquisite treble. My tests indicate that the treble has a slight mid-treble emphasis. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the Oriole presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. The higher pitched notes seemed similar to what I heard on the neutral Aventone planar. The timpani was marginally emphasized, but it did not drown out the other instruments. The Oriole has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the well, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the Oriole made the piano sound like it was 7 feet away. Its bassy notes were not emphasized, and each note melded slightly with the next. The cello was as loud as the piano and sounded, for the lack of a better term, smooth. These instruments, however, remained distinct even while they played together. I heard the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the Oriole rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments melded their tonalities, but none seemed veiled in the mix. The cymbals were second loudest in the mix. The saxophone's higher pitched notes were about as energetic as what I heard on the Aventone planar. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The Oriole did render these differences. Overall, the Oriole seems to have a mid-treble emphasis and a closer to neutral rendition in the upper treble. Sivga says nothing about what we should expect for the Oriole's detail ability. My experience with this headphone gives me the impression that it has above-average detail retrieval. There are instances when it presents the type of details that I have heard on many other headphones, and on very particular occasions when the Oriole presents subtle details that most headphones gloss over. Layered voices is one example when this happens. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of brass, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear on the Oriole. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Sennheiser HT800S presents 22 footsteps. The Focal Clear presents 18 footsteps. The Austrian Audio Hi X65 presents 16 to 17. The Hi X55 presents 16. The Hi X15 and X25BT presents 13 to 14 footsteps. The Hi-Fi Mansandara, Avantone Planar, Sivga Phoenix, and Beyerdynamic DT1990 each present 10 to 11 footsteps. The Monolith M1070, M1570, Sivga Robin, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i all provide 8 to 9. The audeze LCD2 Closed and LCD2 Classic each provide 7 to 8. The M1060C provides 7. The audeze LCD1 and HD6XX present 6 to 7 footsteps. The Neumann NDH20 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. And the Oriole rendered 8 clear footsteps. On my scale of detail retrieval, the HD6XX and LCD1 are the average performers. Any headphone that provides more or less detail is judged accordingly. So the NDH20 would be considered as below average and the Hi-Fi Mansandara as above average. Here, based on this scale, I think the Oriole has slightly above average detail retrieval. Sivga says that the Oriole has wide soundstage. The impression of Soundstage has a lot to do with the original recording methodology, the tuning of your headphones or IEMs, and the earpads or ear tips you wear. Applying DSP or noise cancellation will also affect the result. Here, the Oriole arguably presents wider than typical Soundstage, at least if you're comparing mainstream headphones. If you come from Beats or Bose headphones, then yes, you could say that the Oriole is wide-sounding. But compared to other audiophile headphones, and the experience is different. I have a soundstage scale. Once again, I use the HD6XX and LCD1 as my average performers. Headphones that have more or less soundstage than these two are judged accordingly. The audeze Mobius and all Beast headphones have claustrophobic soundstage. The NDH20 and ATH M60X have below average soundstage. The HD6XX and LCD1 have, obviously, average soundstage. The Sivga Phoenix, Emotiva GR1, and Ultrasone Pro 1480i have average to maybe above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mansandara, Avantone Planar, Austrian Audio IX55 and X65, and LCD2 Classic have above average soundstage. The Hi-Fi Mandiva has wide soundstage, and the HT800S has super wide soundstage. In my opinion, the Oriole has soundstage that is wider than the HD6XX and LCD1, but it is not as wide as the Hi-Fi Mansandara or Avantone Planar. Sivga says that the Oriole has a balanced sound. They make some cursory remarks about the tuning and claim that this headphone has moderate bass, smooth mids, and exquisite treble. I think that the Oriole indeed has a balanced sound signature, generally speaking. The sub-bass seems neutral, mid-bass is elevated marginally. Separation of these two regions is average, or maybe slightly above average, resulting in some melding between them. Bass instruments do not overwhelm other elements in a mix. However, drums tend to be a little bit louder than other elements in a recording. The mids are forward. Vocals usually stand 2 steps ahead of instruments. Female artists receive an emphasis in sibilants. There's a bit above average separation and detail in this region. The treble seems to have a mid-treble emphasis. Upper treble appears to be closer to neutral. There's no harshness in this region. The Oriole has above average detail retrieval and above average soundstage. At the end of the day, Only you can decide if a sound signature like this appeals to you. It's important we compare products. There's no better way to get to the bottom of new products and cut through hype. Here, we will compare the Oriole against the HD6XX, Apos Caspian, and the Sivga SV023. For these tests, I used the stock accessories. I plugged each headphone into a passive AB switch that was connected to my Army ADI2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and tried to volume match. The HD6XX and Oriole have noticeably different bass response. The 6XX overall is closer to neutral, while the Oriole has a marginal mid-bass emphasis in comparison. Separation and clarity in this region is more obvious on the Oriole. Transience is slightly faster on the Oriole. The mids are also different. The Oriole has forward mids while the HD6XX is more neutral. Vocals are 2 steps ahead of instruments on the Oriole and 1 step ahead on the HD6XX. Vocals are closer to the ears on the 6XX. Separation and clarity among elements in this region is more obvious on the Oriole. However, the Oriole does have an emphasis in female vocal sibilants, while the 6XX does not. Treble is different. Upper treble seems to be close to neutral on the Oriole, but the 6XX has a roll-off. On the other hand, the Oriole appears to have a mid-treble emphasis, but the 6XX doesn't. Separation and clarity in this region is a little bit more obvious on the Oriole. The Oriole has greater detail retrieval and wider soundstage than the 6XX. The Caspian is also different from the Oriole. The Caspian has considerably greater bass emphasis both in sub-bass and mid-bass. The Oriole has greater bass clarity and faster transients. The Caspian has more bass bleed into the mids. The mids are different as well. Both headphones keep vocals ahead of instruments, but the Orioles are 2 steps ahead compared to the Caspian's 1 step. The Caspian emphasizes vocal grain and sibilants, but overall this is less than the sibilants emphasis of the Oriole. Separation and clarity in this region is more obvious on the Oriole. Drums tend to be louder in a mix on the Caspian. Treble is dissimilar. The Caspian has an upper treble roll-off while the Oriole is closer to neutral. On the other hand, the Oriole has a mid-treble emphasis, but the Caspian does not. Treble clarity is more apparent on the Oriole. The Oriole has greater detail retrieval and wider soundstage than the Caspian. The SV23 and the Oriole have different bass tuning. The 23 has a sub-bass roll-off while the Oriole has more neutral sub-bass. Mid-bass on the 23 is closer to neutral while the Oriole has a mid-bass emphasis. Transience is a little bit similar, as is clarity, but the 23 is slightly clearer in this region. The mids are similar. Both headphones emphasize vocals and both have forward mids. The 23 and Oriole emphasize vocal female sibilants, but the Oriole's rendition is a bit greater. Clarity in this region is greater on the 23. The treble is somewhat similar. The 23 has an emphasis that starts in the mid-treble and continues into the upper treble. The Oriole, on the other hand, seems to keep its treble emphasis mostly limited in the mid-treble region. Treble separation and clarity is somewhat similar, with the SV23 just a little bit better in this regard. The SV23 has greater detail retrieval. In my new light test, it rendered 11 footsteps. The 23 also has wider soundstage than the Oriole. Comparisons like these help us figure out if a new product is worth our consideration. Maybe the newest fad is not different enough for your liking, or maybe it is exactly what you're looking for. Ultimately, you have to listen for yourself to understand if you prefer one headphone over another. Sadly, the so-called premium headphone brands seem disinterested in the sub-$500 range. In this category, Sivga and Sennheiser, Hi-Fi Man, Audio-Technica, and Beyerdynamic seem to have taken root. In my opinion, none of these companies are any less premium than Audeze or Focal or Meze. Instead, the former that I just mentioned don't waste nearly as much time and effort on gimmicks like the latter I mentioned tend to. Competition is healthy, but sometimes when there's a lot of options, you might stop seeing sufficient differentiation. And that's the danger Hi-Fi Man and Sivga have to be mindful of when they are planning new releases. How do they stay relevant when they have already saturated the market with many other offerings? As far as the Oriole is concerned, I have no hesitation saying that it is value at $200. If you've watched my reviews in the past, then you probably know that I do not place value judgments on sound signature, because that is entirely subjective. Instead, I look at build, accessories, and overall performance attributes. Where sound signature is concerned with the Oriole, it is balanced. Mid-bass has a slight emphasis. The mids are forward and sibilant. There's a mid-treble emphasis. The Oriole has above-average detail and soundstage. Frankly, the most important aspect of any headphone is build and comfort. Even a headphone you want to listen to desperately all day long could be useless if you can't actually wear it. I mean, remember the blonde BL30? In this respect, the Oriole is exceptional. It is light, well-made, sturdy, and very comfortable. The accessories here are pretty good too. While I wish Sivga had included a set of spare earpads, at least you can easily replace them with compatible third-party alternatives. The cable is typical of Sivga. That is, it is well-made, transmits little microphonics, and in other words, is a perfect cable. True, in the $200 price bracket, you have lots of options. The Oriole might not be suited to your preferences, in which case you have other possibilities. But if you're intrigued by what the Oriole has to offer, then I think it is indeed a good headphone deserving of its price tag.